Welcome to Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville. Join 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mike's on Mike. It's great to have you with us, and we want to, of course, thank our sponsor, which is the Jacksonville Historical Society, the great Alan Bliss, and the many donors who have contributed to keep this show on the air with you once a week. Thank you all very, very much. In our last podcast, our guests were Adam Chaskin, CEO of the Jewish Community Alliance, known as the JCA, and Eric Manu, CEO of First Coast YMCA. And we talked about the mission that they've taken on to deal with racism and anti-Semitism, which is prevalent not just here, but across the country. Well, today's guest is Tim Gilmore, who's written and published a book called The Culture Wars of Warren Fowlkes, which chronicles the life and times of perhaps Jacksonville's most public and outrageous racist and anti-Semite. He's the author of 22 books.
Not Warren, but Tim is the author of 22 books.
Yeah, please don't confuse me with Warren Fowlkes.
I'm glad you clarified that. Thank you very much. Let's just take this from the top. No, I'm not going to put you through that all over again, folks, I promise. Tim's the author of 22 books, a PhD professor who teaches writing at Florida State College at Jacksonville. So, Tim, we welcome you to the program. Nice to have you with us.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, this was all before my time. I didn't get here until 93.
You wish. Not in age, but just because you moved here. All right, let's make sure that's understood.
So help me and others who might not know who this gentleman was and why you decided to write a book about him.
Well, gentleman is an interesting word.
I thought so, too.
I was going to...
Lowercase g.
Yeah, well, so he was, as you noted, the most, I guess, infamous rather than famous would be the word, self-avowed white supremacist in Jacksonville, maybe in Florida for a number of decades, ran for office for several decades, sued a lot of people, seemed to go from one conspiracy theory to another, and seemed to always, until later in his life, keep himself in the news, in the headlines. And I knew of Warren Fowlkes before, but what brought him back into my awareness was that I was looking up Florida book bans that had happened in the past. And I ran into early 1970s this person named Warren Fowlkes, who found a copy of a Mickey Spillane novel at the downtown library, the main library downtown, and he was aghast that he said several young people were reading it together and giggling, and Mickey Spillane's wife posed nude on the cover, and so Warren Fowlkes demanded that then City Council President Jake Godbold call the whole council together on the spot for an emergency session, which of course Godbold did not do, and demanded a halt in all funding for the Jacksonville Public Library system until every book in the library system had been screened. That did not happen, but I was just kind of mesmerized and thought, who in the world is this guy? This seems to have some resonances to now. And when I went to see if the Times-Union had much of a file on him in the Florida room, the main library now downtown, they brought out about 3 feet worth of files on this guy. And I just kept pouring through and seeing, envelopes that he sent reporters with giant swastikas on them, and I thought, this sadly is pertinent to our times now. Yeah. So I knew at that point that I needed to find out as much as I could about this guy and write about him.
Well, Tim, when I first came here, it was '69 as a reporter for the Times-Union. And wanting to get to know who people were that I was covering and seeing, I spent a lot of time in the archives at the Times-Union. And I will never forget the day I went to look up Warren Fowlkes. And you're right, it was voluminous. And it makes your eyes want to pop open. It was unbelievable. And I knew Warren. And I remember back in those, a lot of what you wrote about.
Yeah.
Back in those days, a lot I didn't even know about it. It was just, what your research is just overwhelming. Yeah. But my memory back then was that we mostly looked at him sort of as a gadfly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as I alluded to, maybe kind of like the town drunk, except you can ignore the town drunk.
Right.
And there was no way in hell you could ignore Warren Fowlkes. He was omnipresent.
Yeah.
I mean, it was pretty amazing. How many times would you estimate that he was arrested over his life?
I really don't know. I think it probably would be somewhere close to 100.
At least.
Really?
Yeah.
And so people can have some perspective. Kind of help us understand what the climate was back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the racial climate, social climate in Jacksonville.
And I should start by pointing out the irony that, I reached out to you and you were very gracious to me with your knowledge and recollections, for that kind of question. Exactly. Obviously Jacksonville was very segregated at that time. I think for a lot of white Jacksonville, there was the typical sort of idea that Martin Luther King railed against in his letter from a Birmingham jail that, things are just fine as they are and they're peaceful. And, King said that's the kind of peace where you're sitting on top of a powder keg, And of course, 1960s were full of horrible racial incidents in Jacksonville, most famously or infamously Axe Handle Saturday, 1960, but also, riots in 1964, the murder of Johnny May Chappelle, later East Side disturbances when a white man shot a young black man who he said was standing too close to his pickup truck, and all hell really broke loose shortly after that. And there was the effort to get together a biracial committee to work with the mayor's office, and Mayor Hayden Burns shot that down. He, in many ways, was kind of like, I think, and it would be interesting to know what you guys think, but kind of like Jacksonville's George Wallace, in that he said that this town would always be segregated. It would never desegregate. I suspect that when Warren Fowlkes came to town in the early 1960s, he saw a place where he could be prominent, and
big fish in a small pond.
Yeah. And that as time went on, and he saw some of the things that he that he cared about slipping away from him, he became more and more paranoid and conspiracy theory driven.
Where did he come from? You said he came here in the 60s.
Yeah.
Where did he come from?
He grew up in Ocala, and then he was in the Navy during World War II. And when he got out of the Navy, he went to Orlando and actually went into business with his brother there for a while. He got into some trouble in Orlando that had to do with domestic relations with his wife and his children and so on, and moved up to Jacksonville and unfortunately never left.
He had and you chronicle it very well in the book, he always had guns.
Yeah.
But he couldn't get a gun permit.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's ironic, right? Absolutely. And, he had been in some serious legal trouble before he ever got to Jacksonville, and fought really throughout the 60s to try to get a gun permit, although, as you said, he already had guns. And he would do some pretty frightening stunts that he would explain as Second Amendment support kinds of things. Like there was a place that was actually private land outside at the time of the city limits that they called, they meaning a lot of the white supremacists in the area called Lynch Park after Connie Lynch, actually, yeah, who was a I know. Well,
kind of struck me.
I'm sure that those resonances would not have bothered them at all, but they would have effigies of civil rights leaders, but also of the president, of J. Edgar Hoover, and they would have big rallies out there and shoot the effigies, not just burn them, but shoot them. So he always had guns, and although he could never get a permit, and in fact, it is because of Warren Fowlkes that the mayor's office in Jacksonville first I'm sure it would have, but that it got heightened security from gun threats, because he would take his shotgun up to the mayor's office to demand that they give him a permit.
About that.
Yeah,
I came after you one time, didn't he?
Yeah. I kind of prided myself in not being his buddy.
Right.
And every time I could piss him off, I tried to my best to do it. And my office back then was right next to the mayor's, right outside the mayor's office. And one day, Naomi Glover, who was the receptionist, Naomi was
still there.
She's not now. She's gone now. But Naomi was an African American, and everybody loved Naomi. Mm-hmm. And she came in my office one day, and she closed the door, and she said, Mike, you got to get out of here. Warren Fowlkes is out there with a shotgun coming to look for you. And that made me feel real good. So, but the problem was back then they did not have security. Uh-huh. The mayor had no security until that happened, and once that happened, the mayor got security. And when they got security, Warren comes back and tries to beat the guy's ass. The security cop. Yeah. I mean, it was amazing stuff.
Did. Brought razor strop and threatened to whip his buttocks with it. Yeah.
It was amazing. Now, didn't you come across Warren somewhere one time?
Yes. It was in 1976. Y'all remember, that's when I was a Democrat. And I was walking down the street with then the late Senator State Johnny Matthews, who was one of the key folks, is working in Jimmy Carter's campaign. Mm-hmm. And Warren approached, and of course I had my Jimmy Carter button on, and if you all remember, John Matthews, Senator Matthews, was a very imposing gentleman, always looked like he walked out of a bandbox. And Warren saw him and crossed the street and came to him. And Senator Matthews stepped in front of me, and he wouldn't let Warren talk to me, but he said, we're not going to talk to you, and I would prefer that you just move aside. And I didn't know who he was.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And I don't remember the whole conversation. I just remember John Matthews standing in front of me, who was a huge man, having this discussion with a man who, at that time, was very short. It was literally, there had to be a foot and a half between those two men. Mm-hmm. And if I remember, Warren was a very slight little man.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, Senator Matthews, he turned red. Mm-hmm. But Warren came toward him, and it was one of those interesting days.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that.
I bet. Yeah.
Having said this, given what we just talked about that, he ran for office a lot of times.
He did, yes.
How many times did he run, and what was his? How many times did he run, and what was his campaign? His campaign. What was his theme? Why vote for Warren Fowlkes? Yeah. I'm almost afraid to ask.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He did. He ran from the '60s up until the early '90s. He ran for sheriff. He ran for city council. He ran for Florida, the House. He ran for Senate, and he ran for governor.
Kind of Harold Stassen of our time.
And as for what his themes were, they were always. It was always primarily race with Warren Fowlkes. There were lots of other things that upset him. But race was always the primary thing. So he ran, for example, against Mary Singleton, running for the House in 1972, and Mary Singleton was in some ways Warren Fowlkes' worst fear. because Voting Rights Act of 1965. Shortly after that, there are 2 black women on the city council, right? And then
she and Sally Mathis.
Yeah, and then so Singleton runs for House, and he is witnessing black people in power. And I can't help but just love the irony that it's a black woman that must have burned him up even more, I think. Into the 80s, he started to get more focused on what we would now call LGBT issues, gay rights issues. There was a proposed bill to keep gays and lesbians from being able to adopt children, and so lawmakers who came out against that bill, he called them perverts and sodomites and worse things, so that became a big part of his focus. It was always these what we now think of as culture war, hot button kinds of issues, and that is that's what really kind of seized my imagination, seeing this kind of return of culture wars into our politics. Now
It almost begs
that he did this for so long.
Tim, it begs the question: how in the world, or who in the world, paid for his campaigns or his, all these times you run, whether all those things, you've got to put some money down. So and obviously he had campaign material. He had a barbershop.
Right.
Can't imagine that was what funded it.
Right.
It begs the question, who in the devil was his banker?
I think you just answered your own question.
Oh, the devil, yeah.
Yeah.
Are we going to go metaphysical on this show?
Seriously.
Yeah, right, yeah. I think there is. People like J.B. Stoner, who was the attorney for the Ku Klux Klan, who in fact ended up defending Martin Luther King's murderer, and who led rallies, white supremacist rallies in the St. Augustine movement. People like J.B. Stoner were pretty fond of Warren Fowlkes. So, and J.B. Stoner was connected to the National States Rights Party and published the Thunderbolt, that publication, so he did. I think Warren Fowlkes did get some backing from those kinds of groups. Then there were lots of other, he would do things like he would take out big ads in the Florida Times-Union.
That somebody had to pay for.
That somebody had to pay for, but often what he did in those ads was he would call upon his supporters, for a little while there, he started to say, "My supporters, black and white," which was really kind of a ironic, shocking thing to read. But he would call on his supporters to send him what he called love offerings, to send him donations, sometimes including to help pay for the very ad that they were reading. But he was really good at asking people for money.
He did that for bail. He did that for newspaper ads. He did that for political campaigns, and he was always the victim.
Oh, absolutely.
He was
absolutely.
It kind of sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I don't mean to say that, but I was really one of the things that I enjoyed reading about. Obviously, was you recalling Sam Melson and Warren Fowlkes, and of course I knew both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the publisher of the Chronicle after Sam Melson, and I remember the Chronicle's office was placed in a building about this big, but there was a water cooler, an ice water cooler in the corner, and I couldn't figure out why. And one day Sam came to visit me, and about 11 o'clock in the morning, he looks at his watch and he gets out a bottle, he puts some scotch or something in a glass.
5 o'clock somewhere.
And he walks over to the water cooler, and he gets cold water out of the water cooler and comes back and sits down. But the Chronicle back then was nothing but a hate sheet.
Uh-huh.
It was a front for the Klan, and I can recall seeing it later, I guess. He would run a picture of a black person on the cover or that newspaper, and say, in case you don't know, this is an N-word. Or he did the same thing with the Jew. And Sam did that, not Warren.
Right.
Sam did that. And I never forget, this is a digression, but Mr. Wade owned a little restaurant across from City Hall in the corner there where all the city folks used to go eat breakfast and lunch. And after started about the middle of the day, Mr. Wade would start hitting the bottle. And one day, Sam was in my office at the Chronicle, and all of a sudden Mr. Wade comes down, and he's drunk. He's going to his car. He's wobbling. And Sam Melson is wobbling. And Sam looks out, and he sees Wade through the glass window. So he jumps up, and he goes out. He takes a broom handle, and he goes out, and he starts doing this to old man Wade. Old man Wade picks up a trash can lid, and he's doing this at Warren. This is right in the middle of Ocean Street, down near the river. And I'm sitting there watching all this. And finally what happened was they both got so exhausted, they put the broom down and they put the trash can down, and came into the Chronicle and started drinking some more.
I was waiting to see the coconuts going.
You can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't make it.
Wow.
You can't make it up. I'm glad I can still remember.
Yeah.
How did the media treat him?
I think that so he's active for a long time, right? And I think in the '60s, they were pretty objective with him. I think increasingly they understood that this guy is going to be a thorn in our side, whatever we do. And he would do things like, he would demand retractions in the newspaper, or if TV news messed something up, in his mind messed something up. And it didn't have to be anything that would seem significant to anybody else. He was once offended after he had stopped his association with the Ku Klux Klan because I think it was the Jacksonville Journal printed an article that said that he was still affiliated, and so he picketed outside their offices, and he at the time basically was saying that the Klan was doing things too by the book, and he said some really frightening things. I mean, he said that he was looking forward to blood in the streets, and I think increasingly through some of his very bizarre incidents in the 1970s and 80s, the press could not cover these things because he would wrap himself up in certain things that were going on, which maybe we'll talk about in just a little bit, that were pretty prominent. But finally, towards the late 80s and into the 90s, he finally got to a point where nobody cared anymore. It was all old. He had slept in the back of his barber shop for a number of years, and then he didn't have the barber shop anymore. And at that point, he just kind of became this washed up hate monger who still started to wear army fatigues all the time, and he was still out there with his picket signs, but nobody really paid any attention anymore.
Hanging around the Greyhound bus station a lot too. I remember that. Tell us. In this book, you almost wrote a book about. You could write a book about Spinklink and folks. Tell us the story of that. Take as much time as you need, because I think that's really critical in this, to knowing who this guy was.
So this is a really bizarre episode. So John Spinklink had murdered someone in Tallahassee, and was the first person that the state of Florida executed after interim of about a decade of when there was a kind of a de facto moratorium on the death penalty in the United States. And so somehow Warren Fowlkes got it into his head that Spinklink was already dead when they strapped him into the electric chair. And so he wonders, why? What were they covering up? What kind of insider knowledge did Spankalink have that if he got before his small audience, right before his execution, that he could spill on the prison system? And folks thought things like, maybe he had some insider knowledge about prison guards, drug smuggling, and just no evidence for any of this stuff, right? He convinces Spankalink's mother, who lives in California, that this is true. That Spankalink was already dead when they put him in the electric chair, and that he was going to cover. He was about to expose something, so they beat him to death or something ahead of time before they executed him. Lois Spankalink lived in California. And so folks went across country, moved into her house, launched this big campaign to have her son's body exhumed, which he got her to go along with. So he said it was suspicious that there was no autopsy. State said it's not suspicious because we know how he died. So he ended up convincing John Spankalink's mother to pay to have her son dug up.
Exhumed.
And the coroner did an autopsy and said he died by electrocution. And he had apparently convinced Lois Spankalink that she would have been able to sue the state of Florida for $1 million, where that figure exactly came from.
That's a good round number.
And he said that he had convinced her to donate that money to his new effort, which was something called the Conservative Church of Christ. That he had headquartered in his barbershop. So totally bizarre episode that had him actually lined up with some political issues he was completely against. I mean, he supported capital punishment, but Lois Spankalink would protest at the Capitol and in Washington, D.C. She'd hold signs saying, Bob Graham killed my son. And so they were two very strange allies for a second. And of course, to what extent they were ever really allies is questionable, because he really just kind of bullied his way over this grieving mother, So very, very strange episode. One of the strangest, but not necessarily the strangest, believe it or not.
As we come to the close of this particular show, and I know that Tim is going to be with us in the next one.
Correct.
Tim, on the book cover, you wrote, "Any account of Warren Fowlkes that failed to ask what made him the man he was would be a waste." What's the answer to that question?
How long do we have left on this one? Well, in some ways it is unanswerable, right? In some ways we can all point to things that influenced us and people that influenced us and things that happened in our childhood, et cetera, to move us toward being the person that we become. I did find out some really interesting things, some of which I don't want to give away, but without,
Is there another book coming out or something?
No, it's in this one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got to buy the book.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
But I will say, he grew up in Ocala, the son of a preacher who preached, hellfire and brimstone on race and homosexuality and women's role, and he grew up with that, and he soaked it up, and he never really let it go until the end. There are also some really fascinating things that I came upon having to do with what happened to him in World War II. And I'll just say a couple of things. I found it really intriguing and ironic that he would come out of World War II and soon, become a member of the American Nazi Party. He actually spent some time on a captured Nazi cruiser. The British had captured it and given it to the U.S. as a war prize. He spent some time on that cruiser, brought back some Nazi memorabilia from that cruiser, and that cruiser was sent out to the Marshall Islands, where and it's unclear exactly what he did, but he was involved in preparation for continued atomic bomb testing. So, not to suggest that something like that in and of itself would create a Warren Fowlkes, right? But you have to wonder, if the foundation and the template is the home he grew up in, and then there are these other really brutally complicated factors when he's a young man. And he comes out of the Navy, and you have to wonder what kind of role they played in the psyche that he developed.
Well, it's interesting you're talking about that, because last week when we had on Adam Chaskin and we had Eric Mann on with Together Against Hate, one of the things we tried to nail down was, where does this come from? How do we find out what the basis is that creates this hate that they have? And of course, there's no silver bullet here. It ain't gonna just appear in front of us. But
starts at home in a lot of cases.
Well, it does. And that letter that was written from that mother of that student who was going to hear a Holocaust survivor at their high school, and the mother said, no, I'm not letting him in.
Because it didn't happen.
Because it never happened. It's a hoax.
Just unbelievable.
But with all the psychologists we have and all the sociologists we have, I'm really surprised that we haven't really dived into the whole idea of where does this come from? Because if we don't find out what the basis is of that, we're not going to know how to treat it.
One of the things that I kept thinking as I was researching this book and finding out more and more about Warren Fowlkes was just how exhausting it is. I mean, at a certain point, so I quote him at times. But I also didn't want. I quote him quite a bit. But at a certain point, I pulled back on quoting racial slurs, and I would just say he said racial slurs. I mean, I'm thinking, I don't want to write something where you just read 200 pages of pure vitriol. I mean, that's good God. But reading about him and researching him at times was exhausting, and I kept asking myself, how does this sustain itself? How does it not burn itself out? And the thing is, I think that hate is a kind of fuel, that seems to, for some people, seems to be almost bottomless.
Yes.
Tell us what you would ask him if he were sitting in the studio
Oh my gosh.
here with us, and you're preparing to write the book.
Yeah.
What would you ask him?
I think I would ask him. I think I would ask him what made you you? What made you the person who fights these particular battles and never tires of them? I think that is what I would ask him whenever I write. I always a longer project that's biographical in nature. I always feel like I'm trying to get to know the person, and there's only a couple of projects that I've done where I didn't feel like I ever did that. I tried to do that with Warren Fowlkes, even though, you actually did know him, and you're probably thinking, why would anybody try to do that? But ultimately, the question of what makes anybody who they are is unanswerable, right? But I think that is really what I would. That's the kind of thing I'd like to ask.
Well, what's really scary, and what from last week and what we're hearing now is, unfortunately, there are a lot of new Warren Fowlkes out there.
Yeah.
And they're not a person who is looked at as a gadfly. They are dangerous, and they have an agenda, and they're carrying out that agenda.
Right.
And we are seeing the carnage, and we are seeing the devastation, and we're seeing the grief and the evil that comes from that.
Yeah.
Guys,
Absolutely.
we're going to wrap up this first half hour and stick around because next week Tim will be with us again. There's just so much to cover here that we've only scratched the surface on this, and we want to delve into it more and find out more about this whole topic. Once again, our thanks to the Jacksonville Historical Society. I know you wanted to thank them too because that's where the book signing was. Alan, thank you, Alan Bliss, who I was hoping would be able to come in the studio today to join us as an observer, but we'll have him on. Maybe we'll have him on another time. The book is called. We're showing it up here. Okay, good. Culture Wars of Warren Fowlkes. It's available everywhere. I know it's on Amazon, but
It's available lots of places. I always like to plug our local independents.
Yeah, please do.
Shamblin Book Mine, Shamblin's Uptown San Marco bookstore. There's a new bookstore called Happy Medium in Riverside. So, yes, you can get it from Amazon and some of those places.
And the movie comes out when?
God, I hope not.
Oh, wow.
Danny DeVito will be playing.
I think even he'd take a walk on that one.
Thank you, Tim, very
Thank you,
much
Tim.
for being with us. We
Thank you.
appreciate you coming on for our second show as well. Thank you all. Once again, thanks to the Jacksonville Historical Society and to my colleagues, of course. And Tim will be back with us for another episode coming up next week. Hope you've enjoyed this one.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and Mike Miller can be found at your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook and YouTube. Learn more at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversations with Mike's on Mike.